paragraph. Pursuant to Senate Bill number 2475, which was signed into law by Governor Baker on June 16th, 2021, this meeting of the Southborough Housing Opportunity Partnership Committee will be conducted via remote participation to the greatest extent possible. Specific information and the general guidelines for remote participation by members of the public and/or parties with a right and/or requirement to attend this meeting can be found on the Town of Southborough's website at www.southboroughtown.com. For this meeting, members of the public who wish to participate or watch in the meeting may do so in the following manner by finding the meeting at www.southboroughtown.com/remote meetings. No in-person attendance of members of the public will be permitted, but every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access the proceedings in real time via technological means. In the event that we are unable to do so, despite best efforts, we will post on Southborough's website an audio or video recording, transcript, or other comprehensive record of proceedings as soon as possible after the meeting. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here.
Good morning.
So the first thing I would like to do is tackle the minutes. So in your packet, you have the minutes from Wednesday, June 16th. Are there any changes, questions, discussion about the minutes?
Accept the minutes of June 16th as written.
I will second that.
Okay, this is a roll call vote. Sean Wood.
Aye.
Tom.
Aye.
Alex. And Alex, you're muted. I have to hear you.
Aye.
Okay, and Dorianne is in the affirmative as well. Okay, those are approved. Master Plan Committee update. Tom and Sarah, but Tom, go ahead, start it.
So everybody should have received an email from Sarah with the latest one for review. So please take the time. I think with respect to open meeting, just send if you want, Sarah. I'll just take care of all the edits. If anybody has any changes and stuff, I will collect them, and then hopefully for our next meeting, we'll review any changes, edits, additions, subtractions from the report, from the chapter. The thing, and Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, but that still does not have COGS updated. It did not look at had COGS updated graphs.
No, there's only a few that will be updated at this point, and then when we're also going to be doing another set of data updates before we complete the final master plan, hopefully with the 2020 census information. So there'll be a few more updates there, but we have found in working with them again that largely the data that's in the HPP is what's accessible at this time.
So with that said, my ask is still, if you think a graph is not appropriate, useless, do that as a comment that's valuable. Just don't make a comment that the data is old. We know that. But if you think that the statistics or the graph or the report or you know the data itself is meaningless, let me know. Or if you need some more, or you would like a graph or information, statistics about something else that we have missing, that is also a good comment to add.
Agreed.
Okay, is that good?
Yes, John. Oh, sorry.
Okay, so yes, John.
Tom and Sarah, is the what's different on this draft and the last draft? Just what was in red on the last page? Is that the only add-on from the last thing? Because I didn't really read. I'll be honest, I read through it real quick and it looked very similar. And I saw that there was a red line on the last page, and just that was the only difference.
Yeah, it's very similar. There's probably some slight modifications to different chapters. You know, it's probably what, 85% the same, 90% the same.
Yeah. Just minimal kind of changes to the narrative at this point.
Okay, thank you. Looks pretty good. About to make. Thank you.
Looking good, guys. Good job. Okay, Alex, do you have anything to update us with the new subcommittee with capital?
Yeah, the thing that struck me as interesting was the question as to whether the housing authority could take some responsibility for helping manage the whole project. And I have a meeting of the board this evening, but and floating it, the only question I've had so far is where's the funding come from? In other words, obviously it doesn't come out of the Housing Authority's budget. So I'm wondering if it comes from the state. Does anyone know? John?
John?
Yeah, sorry.
Yep, John.
Yeah, I've spoken to Lynn months back just to see if there was any possible grant money or any programs that the state offered to do anything. And with talking to Lynn before, Northborough did a project because the housing director in Southborough also runs the housing in Northborough. And housing in Northborough had purchased land, built a small project over there. The state helped fund it with Northborough, and then afterwards it was turned over to the housing authority. So the housing authority actually runs the property and takes care of it. So moving forward, but it initiated as a town. So we can both talk to it tonight if you're okay with that, Alex, after the meeting or during the meeting, whenever.
During is fine.
No,
I mean,
there was some different monies through the state for funding for housing that the housing authority could, or the town could use, and then somehow turn the property over to housing for its management and future needs. You know what I mean?
that's, I kind of assumed that, but I didn't know if I was fair just to assume it.
There was supposedly like monies, I think, I may be wrong in these numbers, so I'm just throwing these numbers out. There was supposedly monies the state could offer to help, like if you were building a single family, I mean, like a single bedroom unit was like up to $75,000 per the unit that the state would contribute towards it. And if it was like a 2-bedroom, I think it was like 115,000. Those are just numbers I'm just throwing out there. I want to make that perfectly clear that those are estimates that I think I remember from when I spoke with her, but I'll confirm that more with Alex and her tonight after the meeting if she's available. If that's okay.
Yep.
All right, you guys elected your chair and you figured out your minute takers. What else did you get anything?
Actually, could you actually tell, I mean, for mine, who's the chair or co-chair? I don't know that. Who is how is it organized and how is it structured?
Well, it's a subcommittee that was created between 2 members of SHOPSI,
Okay.
1 member of the planning board, and 2 members of the capital planning committee. So the capital planning committee has Andrew Pfaff and Joe Palmer. Andrew Pfaff is the chair of the subcommittee. From planning is Jesse Stein, and from SHOPSI is Alex and Tom Bistical.
Okay.
Bistical. I always mispronounce his name. I'm so sorry, Tom. So they comprise that subcommittee. That subcommittee reports to SHOPSI. So they have their direct report is to us. So when they do things or questions or whatever, they report to SHOPSI. So I was just wondering if you guys came up with anything, but obviously not to discuss for the meeting as of right now. Oh, there's Tom. Hi, Tom.
Looks like a weathered shingle house.
Sorry, everyone. I'm down in the vineyard.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah,
We were just talking to Alex about the new subcommittee and if there was
Oh,
anything
good.
to update us with.
I'm sorry, did you want me to give an update?
Well, we asked Alex and he had a question. Alex, you want to talk to Tom's right there, so you might as well just bring it back up.
I get a question regarding our meeting tonight with the Housing Authority. The questions that have been coming up is about the funding. So it's kind of like I thought that the state would get involved. And I guess that's, not written in stone yet. And then I am unsure as to who has appointed various committee members for it. Do you remember?
For the subcommittee?
The subcommittee, yeah. I haven't seen notes yet.
Oh,
A week ago, I should remember, but
yeah, no, just the people who are on the call. Other than Mr. Palmer, it was, Jesse Stein, you, me, Andrew Pfaff.
yeah, I think the question isn't who's on it. I think the question is which one of us is supposed to be chairing it.
Andrew was elected chair.
Okay.
Andrew Pfaff.
Mhm.
I didn't leave until you guys elected your chair. So Andrew Pfaff is your chair.
Right. I think we elected me for my chair, me as the chair, but I'm happy to give.
Oh,
Nathan
well,
the chair.
then you changed it. You
And
changed
actually,
it after I left.
no, that was the actual vote, but,
Let's
and then
discuss it.
Andrew would have been a great chair, but he sort of demurred because like he's got young kids and, you know, there's a limited amount of time he can.
Okay. Then
Look,
you
why don't we
changed
give, this is Shopsy, so why don't we give a report on what we sort of talked about on that subcommittee to the Shopsy, Shopsy committee. You know, this was the subcommittee to you know, explore options for the South Union School building, of course. And so we talked about a couple of different options, including, you guys have always heard about me talk about 40R, but Andrew, you know, had a better idea. You know, I talked about 40R was one option, which would basically make 10% of the units, if it was housing, 10% of the units would be affordable, which would be good. But in further discussion, this was Andrew's, you know, suggestion, is that if the Southborough Housing Authority were to take it over and develop it themselves with state funds, and you know, they're tied into all these funding sources for affordable housing, they can make the whole project affordable housing, which is obviously better than 40R, than making 10% of it affordable. So, you know, we only had one meeting. It was, you know, half of it was, you know, electing a chairperson and figuring out who's going to do the minutes and all this stuff. So, you know, we're not deep into the vagaries of what that is going to entail. But from a big picture strategy standpoint, that's sort of where we're heading. And so I think Alex's charge tonight, when he meets with the housing committee, is to introduce the subject to the housing authority, see if they'd be interested in doing it. And, you know, once we get off that first conceptual step, then we can start getting into more of the weeds. So anyway, that's a quick snapshot on where we're sort of starting to head on the subcommittee.
Okay. Any other questions for them? Nope. Okay. Sarah, I will let you take it from here with the Affordable Housing Trust.
Sure. So just to transition from our last discussion, I did get an email from Jesse asking me to reach out to DHCD in regards to supporting the subcommittee with some answers on, you know, the definition of reasonable size for the MBTA communities, to find out if the South Union school building parcel itself could be denotated as the entire district, as well as the location in proximity to the train station, because it's just outside of that half-mile mark. So
Oh, it is.
just to
Makes sense.
it's just
Ooh.
like just barely.
0.6.
So I did put those out to DHCD. I have not received an email back yet, but hopefully we'll get some guidance from them on both of those questions. And so now our expert, John McCartan, who's going to be helping us to write the 5-year strategic plan, is in the audience. And so I'm going to promote him over to panelist. He has a quick PowerPoint for us this morning, and he's going to start the discussion in terms of getting us started in this process. So John and I have had an opportunity to talk a couple of times. I'm really, you know, like I said at our last meeting, was really encouraged by, you know, the scope of work that he put together, and in our discussions have gone really well. And I know that he's done some of the legwork to set up getting ready to have this discussion and start to do the work. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks for that intro, Sarah. And thank you to all the members of ShopC for having me this morning and for accommodating the remote meeting requests. We at MAPC are still all remote through, I believe, Labor Day. So at that point, we'll be back in town halls. And I'm looking forward to that day. So as Sarah said, I'm the consultant here representing the housing team at MAPC for the Southborough Affordable Housing Trust Fund Strategic Financial Plan, which is a mouthful and I trip over it basically every time I say it, but hopefully we'll find a snazzy name by the end here. I do have some slides that I'm just going to share real quick. See if I can get this going. All right. This is not the most snazzy slideshow in the world, but if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to make sure I can see all your faces. We're talking about this. Okay. So it sounds like you did discuss the scope at the last meeting. Okay, so I won't belabor that really. My agenda for today is just meet you all, get to know, sort of where your head is at, talk about the project a little, talk about how we fit this project and really the Affordable Housing Trust Fund into town goals and the existing housing toolkit you all have. Go over some of the trust fund assessment that I've done, which is really so far in progress work. As you know, this meeting and subsequent meetings will be part of like that fact finding and assessment, and then talk about your vision for the future of the trust fund and what direction you'd like to see it go in. So yeah, I'm John McCartan. As I said, I'm with the MAPC housing team. I do not live in Southborough, I live in Alston. But I hope you don't hold that against me. Why housing? And this is really just meant to give me a little more insight into you all personally. Personally, housing was really important in my life. I grew up with not a whole lot of money, but in a neighborhood that did kind of have quite a little bit of money, and that afforded me quite a bit of opportunity. And I also saw how my mom, a single parent, how hard she struggled to make sure I had that opportunity through housing. So that's sort of what brings me to housing on a personal level. On a professional level, I'm an urban planner in Massachusetts. How can you not think about housing all the time? That's sort of what brought me to this field. But that's just me. So yeah, if we could just do a round robin here, I'd love to meet you all.
Hi, John. I am
Hi.
Dorian Jasinski. I'm the chair of the committee, and I am interested in housing because I believe that we should be giving back to community members and helping as many people as we can and giving them a better life if it's possible. John? You're muted.
Can't hear me complaining that I knew I was on mute. I was trying to get to it. Hi, I'm John Wood. Been in town about almost 40 years. My family has been here for multi-generations. My wife's family, I changed that. I, like you, grew up in an affluent community of Wayland as a not very affluent family. Been given very many opportunities in my life, and I had an unsuccessful run for selectman, which I'm really happy about a few years ago. And when I ran, I wanted to try to be able to keep seniors in and affordable housing. And so I put my money where my mouth is. I'm on SHOPC, I'm on the Housing Authority, I'm also on the Economic Development Committee. Prior to being on those committees, I was on the advisory committee, financial advisory committee for 10 years, chaired it for 3. And here I am.
Alex?
Alex Frisch. I grew up in Chestnut Hill. I've been living in Southborough for about 10 years now. And although my political involvement has generally been with historic district commissions, I live in the senior housing here in Southborough, so it seemed appropriate to get involved.
Tom?
Tom Collier. I've been here 23 years in Southborough. Actually, I have to think. I've been here ever since my youngest son was born is when we moved in, like 2 months later. So I always ask him, how old are you? Okay, that's how many years I've been living here. Besides SHOPC, I'm also on the Trails Committee in Southborough. And one of your questions is why housing? Very similar to what John said is, we're kind of like, my kids grew up in town, so you become friends with a lot of parents of those kids. John Wood is actually one of them. we had 2 kids, same age, and we went to the school system. And with that, I see a lot of people now that their kids are out of town, they want to downsize, they're actually moving out of town, which is kind of sad. It's like you get these lifelong 20, 25-year relationships, and all of a sudden because they want to downsize, because they want to start reducing the complexity of their house, they move to neighboring towns or even further away. So we need a diversity of housing within Southborough so people can age in town or age in place. And that's one of the interests that I have in ShopSeat, to make it, one, affordable, because we can't have all affluent people. We need a diversity of our citizens in the town. So we just need some creativities around that.
And Tom B?
Hi, John. I'm Tom Bissicool. I'm a commercial real estate lawyer. I've been in Southborough for 18 years. And I've been on a couple of different town boards over that time period. I was on the Board of Appeals for 5 years, and just everyone else that you're seeing is way more involved in the town than I am. But I try to pitch in situations where I think I can be of help. And on housing, one of the things that's, I agree with everything that everyone just said. We need more affordable housing in town. But what fired me up a little bit is that we did our housing production plan that DHCD requires us to do every few years last year, I believe. And one of the conclusions they had was that, not so much that there was a lack of low-income housing, which everyone knew. Every town out here, has a shortage of low-income housing. What really got me was that they found out there's really a shortage of moderate income housing. Someone who makes $100,000 a year, which is a pretty good income, can't afford a starter home in Southborough and can barely afford a market rate apartment unit in Southborough. So from my perspective, I sort of echo what Tom just said. I don't want us to become Weston and Dover. I want the school teacher to be able to live in Southborough, or the first responder to live in Southborough, or the artist to live in Southborough, and younger people who have lower incomes to live in Southborough. So that's sort of where my perspective is on affordable housing.
Sarah, do you want to add anything about yourself? And you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think John and I have kind of talked about it a little bit. And just to reiterate to the group, I mean, I'm personally passionate about housing because I had an opportunity to live in an affordable unit in Stockbridge for about 9 years with my son. And Stockbridge is a, very affluent community in Berkshire County. So, I was able to give him a really great quality of life and a good school system, as opposed to Pittsfield, where, he was originally born and where we had our first apartment. So I just think that it's really important to be able to serve, a multitude of individuals in communities.
Awesome. Well, it's
Okay.
super nice to meet all of you. Yeah, Sarah knows how excited I am about this project. It's really cool to get to be here and doing like very implementation focused work and sort of, getting to where the rubber meets the road. So to discuss a little bit about what our goals here, what they are. Again, you saw the scopes. I won't go through this too much, but we want to create a realistic 5-year strategic financial plan, inclusive of what projects and programs the trust fund should pursue, as well as a 5-year budget. And then there's part of the scope is to draft a warrant article that will automatically transfer CPA housing funds to the trust fund on an annual basis when that, sort of when they are allocated, to sort of ensure that the trust fund has, sort of regular funding and start to make deals based on that regular funding. Our tasks here I'll run through some of these, some of the content we've put together already today, but town goals and capacity assessment. We're not repeating the HPP. You just did that. I read it. It was awesome. But just sort of make sure that we have, MAPC has a shared understanding with you all on sort of what the town's capacity is. An assessment of the trust fund as it exists today. So sort of what's the prior work been? What's the funding look like? What's potential future funding look like? Who, acts as sort of personnel, whether sitting on the trust fund or, as a close advisor or something like that. Stakeholder engagement, which is, I would say, mostly internal to the town, or like sort of related agencies. So talking to different, committees or commission members, talking to, say, like the sort of social service wing of the town who might get requests for housing assistance, stuff like that. Then also hopefully talking to some residents of existing affordable housing to understand sort of what the needs, what the experience has been like, and what needs have sort of been met and maybe not met. From all that, that's all like fact finding. We'll put together some opportunities and scenarios. So, this is what programs, developments, strategic directions the trust fund can go in, like lay those all out on the table and then go through different scenarios of how the trust fund could, spend its existing capital and future money. And then during that scenario construction process, we'll talk about, say, what the different options are, and ShopC will help us come to a sort of a preferred alternative. And that'll be sort of the plan going forward. We'll write a plan, we'll write a budget, and then we'll draft a warrant article, and that'll be that. So it's pretty tight in its scope. We're really just trying to get a realistic plan together and make sure the trust fund can function going forward. This will all happen over, roughly 6-month timeline from this June when we got started through December, and we'll proceed more or less linearly through that time. We're already sort of getting started on what the opportunities are, even though it's, late July. So some things, there will be a lot of overlap or some overlap in the timeline at least. Then we'll work towards adoption. I believe, there's no, unlike an HPP, there's no sort of like legal framework for adoption, but the trust fund, I would imagine, will want to adopt this as the plan with ShopC's endorsement. Just to talk a little bit about MAPC's role. So MAPC is the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. As you may know, we're the regional planning agency for the 101 cities and towns, with sort of Boston at the center. You all are at the western edge of the region, and then it goes up to sort of Ipswich and then down to Duxbury. So kind of hemicircle around Boston. And I've done a lot of work, both, in the sort of what are deemed inner core communities, something like, Somerville, Melrose, Quincy. But I've also done work, similarly at the edge of the region. Your Foxboroughs. I've actually, but prior to my time at MAPC, done work in Worcester, and Haverhill, so I've been sort of have a stronger footing in the state itself. MAPC, we're a statutorily required nonprofit where the executives of the cities and towns are our board, plus a couple of governor appointees. So it's a little bit of a weird structure. We're not a state agency, but we are. We call it quasi-public. But that structure allows us to be, maybe more mission-driven than something like a DHCD. Like, we have a perspective. We focus on smart growth, equity, sustainability, and we have that regional perspective. So that's sort of what we're trying to bring to the table, and why you might want us as a consultant. I'll just also talk about funding here. The project has a $15,000 budget. 2,500 of that comes from the trust fund directly, and then the remaining balance comes from MEPC's district and local technical assistance program, which is sort of state funding, more or less. So a lot of this the presentation today is not necessarily news to you, but it's sort of aligning what we already have in terms of housing goals and what tools you have with this project scope. A little bit of it is just framing for us as we move forward in the 6-month process. It's also a little bit of like fact checking. I'm not from Southborough. I'm not on the numerous committees that you all are. So if something seems wrong, feel free to point it out. So first, I just want to talk about the master plan. I know you're involved in making a new master plan that's set to come out soon. But I want to emphasize that the master plan goals, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund can play a role, obviously, in supporting the housing goals, but also to a greater or lesser extent can play a role in implementing all of these other goals. Whether it's municipal facilities or say open space, economic development. It's sort of, if you play your cards right with the trust fund, you can have an impact on increasing access to open space. You can have an impact, generating more customers for local businesses. You can think about it in this holistic way. So I don't want to think of it as fully siloed as a housing strategy, even though obviously that is the sort of powers and mandate of a trust fund. You just did this HPP, and I would say the trust fund can directly implement all of the HPP goals to a greater or lesser extent, and then it can really directly implement these I have listed on the screen here. So I pulled these from, or sort of paraphrased these from the HPP. But certainly building partnerships and securing funding is a big part of what the trust fund or what trust funds can do. Guiding development, often through sort of like catalytic development or making the development you would like to see in town. That can be a sort of role for the trust fund. Some trust funds have this education component. They will spend, a portion of their money on holding events or funding surveys, that sort of thing, holding discussions. Identifying publicly and privately owned opportunities, that's something that we're going to really work on as part of this plan. So the trust fund already actively doing that. And then assisting first-time home buyers is certainly a specific strategy trust funds choose to pursue. So all of that in the HPP, we can play a role in this process to sort of work towards implementation for those strategies. Housing toolkit. So this is not a term of art. This is something we just throw around on our team here. Is like, so what are the tools you have in your toolbox already? Thankfully, Southborough already has a lot. In a lot of towns I go to, we're just like, maybe you should get an affordable housing trust fund. Maybe you should pass CPA. You all have already done that. That's great. So we can sort of take that off the table. But I do want to talk about the different tools you have and how they might impact. So as we've already kind of discussed, you have many official agencies, committees, boards, commissions that are actively involved in housing matters. There's the trust fund, of course, you all, SHOPC, the Board of Selectmen, which plays a role, I could think, on most of these committees, certainly the trust fund and has the SHOPC rep, the Housing Authority, and got Alex here repping that. Planning Board, ZBA, Capital Planning Conservation, Town Meeting Advisory Committee, all of these different bodies play a role. And that can be both a good and bad thing, where I say mostly good, mostly positive, where housing is sort of on the agenda. I've in reviewing, say, Affordable Housing Trust Fund minutes, and going over some of the past work, having all of these different cooks in the kitchen can also lead to gaps in communication. Different agencies not really sure who's sort of holding the ball. So I think, there is, I don't want to overstate this as a problem. Towns have committees, it's perfectly normal. But I think it's just something to be mindful of as the trust fund moves forward. I'm particularly curious about how you envision the relationship between the trust fund and ShopC. We can talk about that a little more when we have a more open discussion. There's a handful of zoning vehicles that can be used to build affordable housing, potentially. Conventional single-family development, the trust fund has funded affordable housing, using that as a zoning vehicle already. Accessory apartments, which is, I believe, from the HPP, subject to an untracked cap. Those could be a way towns, a handful of towns across the Commonwealth will fund construction of accessory apartments for private homeowners and bring with it an affordability restriction. Yeah, there's a couple in the Cape, interestingly. John?
If you have an accessory and it's got a restriction for affordable, does that count towards our census and our 40B?
It could, yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Didn't know that. Thank you.
Sure. You gotta meet all the DHC requirements, but yeah, they totally could. I see there's the single family to two family conversion, which could work. Multifamily for elderly is certainly something that for elderly disabled units could work. Major residential development is sort of, I guess, the vehicle, I believe, introduced in 2013, if I'm getting that right, that allows for some forms of multiple family dwellings. The HPP had sort of indicated, and I would concur with their analysis. I haven't done a full zoning analysis myself because it's out of scope, but it might, just given the land area requirements in the major residential development zoning, it might not be super viable as an affordable housing strategy without doing quite a bit of buying up parcels, which would just be difficult. So that may or may not be a vehicle that the trust can consider. Sort of fingers crossed, I guess. And then in lower impact development as a sort of flexible model for maybe doing something like cottage housing could potentially be used. I'm not, I haven't done a full on zoning analysis. I can't commit to that, but potentially. Now the inclusionary rules are super reasonable, but from my understanding, not often activated. Correct me if I'm wrong here. I believe they're tied in directly to the major residential development. Yes, okay, and super. Just from a formal, looking at the law perspective, super reasonable set of requirements here with discretionary bonuses and then the middle income bonus. I think super cool structure. The question is just really how often is it going to come into play because of really the dimensional or density requirements of the zoning vehicle it's attached to. Now, I'm always hesitant to put Chapter 40B in as a zoning vehicle. I'd say most towns have a kind of adversarial relationship with past or present 40Bs. I'll just note that a lot of, this is not news to you, but a lot of your SHI does come from 40B units, 213 in Southborough proper. And then there's the ongoing question of Park Central, which I personally won't wade into. I know it's a matter of some discussion, but that could add up to 180 units. And then, of course, we all know that with rental buildings permitted under comprehensive permits, only 25% have to be, deed restricted income restricted affordable housing units, though all of them count on the SHI. As far as I can tell, there's been no friendly 40B developments. That's, as you may be aware, when a town and developer has a aligned vision on what they would like to happen, but the zoning as it exists doesn't permit it, and they do use a comprehensive permit as a way to sort of work around the zoning, which is a little bit inelegant. It's a little bit hacky. It sometimes verges on spot zoning, though I don't think that's ever been a legal challenge. However, it is often the most realistic option for permitting an affordable housing development. You see it happen with nonprofits. Honestly, it's like where a lot of the friendly 40Bs come in. Like a town doesn't want to change open up its whole zoning code to say for-profit multifamily, but they might use a comprehensive permit to work with a nonprofit like, NOAA or Habitat for Humanity to sort of get a project permitted. So it's something you can think about as a tool. It's a little bit awkward, but it does work. And then we can think about this new MBTA Communities requirement as, I heard your discussion on the South Union school site. So it's obviously something that you all are thinking about already. There is this question about what is reasonably sized that you all were discussing. In terms of the South Union school site, all right, I don't have any more information than you do on sort of what DHCD is thinking. I would be surprised if they started letting up on that half-mile radius requirement, even if it's just a little bit. So you might see that they would. It's certainly fine to extend a district outside of that half-mile radius. They might want at least some of the district to be in that radius. Again, I don't have any more information than you do. I just sort of I know that they might not want to bend their rules quite yet. And then, oh yeah, the other piece here is there's real questions about the feasibility due to septic requirements and how that plays in, because obviously Southborough doesn't have sewer to really tie into. Funding, good mix of funding sources. Obviously, CPA is the steady source for most affordable housing programs at a local level. But you all have used developer fees in the past. CARES funding obviously is a big thing for your rental and mortgage assistance program. State public housing programs that I know that was discussed a little earlier in reference to the Union school site. So South Union. So it certainly CARES not on the table anymore, but the rest of those can kind of still be considered important sources. And then there's potential sources, ARPA funding. So that's the latest American Recovery Plan Act funding. I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Some communities use free cash or stabilization funds. In Southborough's case, that's a thing. I know it's not. Some communities will either do it, when it's available and say like, hey, we don't have our rainy day fund is good, let's put some towards housing. Some communities have a policy that says if the free cash for a certain year reaches a certain threshold, they'll like divvy it out between these different vehicles. I think Brookline puts some portion of theirs in their trust fund. So that's probably more controversial, but some communities do it. Fractional payments or payments in lieu for your inclusionary zoning. Again, if inclusionary happens and there's some sort of deal made through payments in lieu. I can't remember now actually if you have fractional payments built in. But sometimes deals are reached around inclusionary zoning and that could go into a trust fund. Melrose, for instance, just reformed their IZ, their inclusionary zoning, because they were getting a lot of sort of gaming of the threshold of when inclusionary requirements kick in. And they're like, all right, well, we see from this like 5 unit to 7 unit threshold, no one can really actually build the unit. It like doesn't pencil out. So just give us sort of a fractional payment, and then that goes straight into their trust fund. And that's sort of they don't have CPA. So that's sort of one of the ways that they're thinking about funding it. And then MassWorks, which would not be a direct funding source for a trust fund, but it is something the town I know has thought about and could think about in the future as a way to facilitate development opportunities. Oftentimes you see this for like sewer or sort of road intersection signalization or alignment, sort of adding safety features to make a piece of land more desirable and safe. Again, without having sewer to really tie into, this might come less into play, but it's certainly something to think about. All right, so briefly, I'll just touch on my assessment thus far. So I went through, there was some discussion of past work in the 2008 master plan. Then I went through the trust fund minutes. I think they're available online going back to 2017. So I don't have maybe the full picture. There's a couple years missing in there. But I'd say looking at the past work, there is actually a diverse set of projects, which is in a way kind of super encouraging to me. There's, I saw new housing construction. There's conversion of an unsubsidized low-cost housing. I think it was like a small house at One Porterville, converting that to permanent affordable housing using, in collaboration with town meeting and then also the housing authority, sort of making that project happen, which is pretty wild. Preservation of existing affordable housing units, so 10 Fitzgerald and 16B Stockwell, and then direct housing assistance during the COVID era. So that's a range of things, everything from new construction to sort of direct assistance program administration. Really encouraging to see all of those kind of in the mix. They make use of partnerships, which is super cool. They're small. We're talking 1-2 units at a time. It's not bad. I'm not dissing it. It's just, they're small. And it's not, they weren't always, it seemed like the most efficient use of time and resources. So something like 16B Stockwell, you go through the minutes, that took about 3 years to preserve that unit. It was a complicated situation. There's like negotiations with the owner. There's the retaining wall problem. It's a mess, but it was 3 years for one unit, which is, it's good. Again, I'm glad that unit is preserved, but it might be, we might want to think about how to use things more efficiently. And then from like a per unit spending basis, it's not necessarily the most efficient use of resources the way it's been done in the past. I'm a little reticent to say that because if you try to build an affordable housing unit today, it often costs, easily $400,000, $500,000, $600,000. And that, since I've been working in the field, that number has gone up like $200,000. So I always go back to 400 and I have to correct myself. And obviously your spending or the trust fund spending has been way below that. We're talking, I think, 350 for 2 units. Like from that perspective, that's actually a crazy efficient use of resources, and y'all should be commended for that. On the other hand, some of the most active trusts try to get that to say below 100 on a per unit spend. I heard the head of the Brookline Trust say he didn't want to spend more than 50K on a single unit. Now that's Brookline. They do denser projects than you would be doing in Southborough. But they also do a lot of partnerships and leveraging public money with private dollars, which can be its own sort of headache, but that is how you get a spend to be closer to 50K per unit. So I don't mind a trust that goes out and does it on its own. I think active government, not reliant on our wacky tax credit system, that's great. But it's something to think about as we look 5 years ahead and with the level of funding you have. Speaking of, the trust is roughly 500,000 to be spent at the moment, where this is as of the HPP, which is like a year ago, where 313 of that is in CPC housing reserve. So it's not actually committed to the trust fund. There's no actual requirement that on a legal level that the CPC has to transfer it to the fund. Like the CPC could make housing allocations on its own on a project level. But assuming that that's not something that the Community Preservation Committee wants to undertake, that would be money that I would think get transferred to the fund. So yeah, it's not committed. Of course, almost 200,000 of that is committed. And just needs to be transferred. I know probably this changed a little bit. There was rent and mortgage assistance in the last year. I don't know if all of that was backfilled by CARES, but it sounds like at least some of it was. And then there was a handful of expenses from 16B Stockwell. So that's a decent chunk of change. It's a lot. It's both a lot and a little. If you're doing ground up development, that could easily be one unit. If you're thinking about how to spread that a little farther, that's why we're here to do the strategic plan. The other elephant in the room here is that ARPA could more than double your budget in theory. So again, American Rescue Plan Act, about 3 million, I believe, is going to Southborough, between the direct payments to non-entitlement communities, as well. The federal government made an allocation to counties because not all of our counties exist per se in Massachusetts. That's just getting allocated directly to towns. So for Southborough, it's about 3 million. There's the sort of program requirements on how you could spend that, but there's no required breakdown on how it gets spent. Let's say the governor's proposed allocation of the Commonwealth resources was to put 20% of its ARPA money towards housing. So if you just assume that we're following his lead there, that would leave us with about 600K going to housing, which in theory would be transferred to the trust fund. Again, not required, but could be. So there's a lot of ifs, there's a lot of contingencies there, but that's 600K that could work towards housing, which when we scoped this project, we were thinking about that 500,000 number. We were even really just thinking about that 200,000 number that's directly committed. But if we're thinking about what could potentially happen in the next 5 years, it's quite a bit bigger than that. And then there's who sits on the trust. So some of this is statutory. So there's Board of Selectmen members. There's a couple appointed members, I believe, from the BOS. As we sort of ran through the intros, it's people with a long history of service to the town, which is great. It's a lot of local expertise. It's a lot of expertise of the history, ins and outs of the budget, how these boards and commissions interact. I will say there's not as much experience with affordable housing development or program administration at sort of scale. So, I know there's people in this room who have experience with like doing commercial real estate. But on the trust fund itself, I believe there might be less of that. And there's also commercial real estate, and then there's the mess of affordable housing development. Our system in the US is wacky. It's hard to pull off doing anything sort of at scale. And here I'm meaning like more than like 4 or 5 units at a time. Requires honestly like specific affordable housing development professional experience. I couldn't pull it off as a sort of housing planner. People who do market rate development don't do it typically. So depending on how the trust wants to go, what types of projects it pursues, it could think about looking for someone in town who might be both willing to serve and has that experience. That's kind of a tall order. Those people don't always exist. But I don't know, something to think about for the future.
Hey, John, can I ask a quick question on that? Because we've had that same problem, just like us on Shopsy. We're trying to get affordable housing. I'm a commercial real estate lawyer. I don't know anything about affordable housing. The rest of the people on here are smart people dedicated to the town, but none of us are real estate developers. I imagine we're not dissimilar to countless other towns and communities throughout Massachusetts. So I've always thought the most efficient way to do this is to do zoning and let the professionals give incentives to the professional developers to come in and do affordable housing, give them incentives to create affordable units, not to try to Shopsy with our $500,000 budget to try to develop a 40-unit, apartment building. It's just not feasible. We don't have the expertise. We don't have the, nearly the amount of funding. So what do other communities do? How do they develop a 40-unit, mixed rate or affordable unit? How do they go about that?
I mean, the cleanest answer is partnerships. So it's very rare, honestly, for a trust fund to be directly developing anything.
Right.
If any agency is doing it in a town, it's often the housing authority. And I'm, still learning about your housing authority here. In a lot of communities I work in, like they haven't developed anything more than a single unit in 40, 50 years. So there isn't maybe even necessarily the expertise there. So it's often partnerships. The role that a trust fund can play in those partnerships is, and when we're talking about the amount of money that you all have, it would be more about, if you've got land, giving the land, maybe a small sort of, almost just pro forma contribution to a project. But I mean, really land is going to be the big thing for an affordable housing developer. And then they're going to come in with their expertise of, say, state grants, and potentially federal money, to actually pull off the project. It is, useful to have someone in the room who has, enough experience with affordable housing that it's not just like a total learning curve for everyone. Though that happens too. And like, again, you're all smart people. Like you've all been at this for a while. Like you can figure it out. You can figure it out. I also say here, technical assistance and training could just, bring you up to speed on sort of what the programs are, baseline of how they function. I'm definitely not saying like you all need to become experts in this. That would be unreasonable.
No, but I mean, if we did a partnership where we had an affordable housing developer who already knew the ins and outs and just said, hey, we have this building or this piece of land, great opportunity for you to do a project here. Let's work out the business terms. You agree to make 20% of the units moderate income housing, and we'll give you density requirements and things like that. And let's work it out into a big agreement. And then, if everyone signs on the dotted line, then we'll convey the land to you and let you do your project.
Yeah, that's sort of.
Is that basically the way it's structured?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
You would usually ask for a little bit more in terms of the affordable requirement if you're giving away the land.
I don't even I'm already showing my ignorance. But that's the idea. You work out ahead of time what kind of project they're going to do, and then you let them run with it. They have the expertise. They have the financing. They've got the development experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks, John.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, right now all of this is statutorily defined. I know there's some appointed roles that could be, if you did find that diamond in the rough there, like you could think about appointing them. But it's not like this isn't like a big glaring problem that's unique to Southborough. I don't want to paint that impression, but it's just something to think about for the future. All right, so now I'm just going to talk about sort of where the Affordable Housing Trust can go, and I do want to sort of open it up to more discussion, so it's not just me talking. But we want to ask ourselves, what kind of Affordable Housing Trust Fund do we want to be? The Mass Housing Partnership draws this one big distinction that I think is useful. Are you a funder or are you a facilitator? Are you acting as sort of a pass-through where you like issue RFPs, you know, you maybe find a program you like that's run at sort of a regional level, and you sort of pay for them to increase their, you know, footprint in Southborough, or are you really facilitating, you know, deals where you're like finding the developer, you're you know, you're getting the land ready, you're maybe holding the land for a little bit, you're at the planning board making it happen. So that's a more like active facilitation role, and a lot of that has to do with people's capacity and interest in being a facilitator. What sort of scale projects would you want to do? So on the development side, like, do you want to keep doing like 1 to 2 unit projects? Or are we thinking more small multifamily? So something that would be like, you know, 3 family, 4 family type of project, maybe even going up to 9, I would sort of count as a small. High impact projects, you will find, I think, there's a valley in your ability to pull things off between that sort of small multifamily, say less than 10 units, and a really high impact project. And by that, I mean about 60 units. Because at 60 units, you start to get federal money in play. And that's typically the low income housing tax credit, which they're not really, you know, so that goes to the federal government, gives it to DHCD to administer. And then they're not going to really pay out for anything less than 60. And that would be like an all affordable project. So it's going to be hard, I think, to find projects that hit that 40 that Tom just brought up. You know, it could happen. The right developer with the right resources, you know, Southborough being a wealthier community, there might be some interest in doing like access to opportunity stuff. So I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying you are going to find that valley. And then, okay, so value for money questions. I talked about it a little, like what's your per unit target spend for a development? Do you want to leverage public resources with private funding? And then I already talked about that Brookline example. And then types of different strategic approaches we could take here. There's sort of direct development, the trust fund pays for it all, similar to sort of what you've done before, which is, I would say, slow and steady production, but you know, limited by that local capacity. Everyone's got jobs. And then the funding is smaller. There's a sort of land banking approach you could take, which is like, all right, let's say ARPA money comes through, you're flush with like, you know, more than $1 million. Let's just focus on getting site control, and we'll work out the details later. Maybe we'll just like dispose of a property here and there to Habitat, you know, after we've got all the site control. So you're really just laser focused on site control. There's what I call moonshot development, which is, again, more of that like 60 unit low income housing tax credit project where it might be something smaller, you know, like I'm not super familiar with the South Union site, so I don't really know what it would fit. But like, you know, really putting all your money into like one project that could really, that you really think could make a difference. Public housing support, you know, a lot of times you see trust funds funding like modernization, weatherization, that sort of thing. And then there's like non-development programs. You know, the HPP talked about first-time home buyer programs. Sometimes at the state level, those programs are being repositioned as first-generation home buyers as a way to sort of target communities who were historically excluded from homeownership. But that sort of, you know, depends on the program there. There's also like equity sharing and buy down programs, which this could be part of a first generation or first time home buyer thing, where it's like the trust fund is paying for, say, a big portion of a home price, and going to take up also a portion of the equity growth in the home. It's a little, there's a big debate in the Massachusetts affordable housing world right now about wealth building and equity sharing and all that, which we don't need to get into now. But, you know, so there are questions about whether or not you want to do that. I mentioned before affordable accessory units, paying for the construction there. Accessory units, you know, banks sometimes have trouble lending on them if you don't have like a lot of money, a lot of equity in your home already. So this would be a way to produce more affordable or more accessory units and add maybe an affordability component. Upgrades to existing homes, accessibility, aging in place, certainly something that people are thinking more and more about. Weatherization is a thing that happens, or sort of like weatherization is kind of an older term now. I think it's being more inclusive with like green upgrades, like making homes more efficient in general. And then housing stability measures, you all have done the rent mortgage assistance, paying for certain eviction and foreclosure prevention measures like right to counsel. I don't know how big of an issue that is in Southborough. My guess is not as much as other communities, but it's something you could think about. Anyway, oh God, there's more here. Opportunity sites. I really want to hear from you where you think the opportunities are in the community. We've talked about South Union a little bit, but also is there other publicly owned land? Properties owned by small landlords are a way. Landlords more than homeowners are more willing to deal. So that's something you can look at. I don't know how many small landlords you have in town, but there's probably a handful. Existing homes in disrepair, looking at One Courteville is a good precedent there. Then obsolete commercial development, which I know has been discussed a little bit. So maybe Route 9 properties or offices, sites that just aren't that active anymore. Then a whole bunch of guiding questions. You don't have to respond to all these. What types of projects or programs do you want to pursue? How much program administration does the trust fund want to take on? How quickly do you want to draw down existing funds? I mean, some of this is going to be best practice, but some of this is just your preference. Like if you have 500K now, how quickly do you want to draw that down? What minimum reserve would you like to have? It's good for a trust to maintain some level of reserve. So as opportunities come up, you can sort of strike while the iron's hot. Where geographically should the focus be? That's sort of tied into sites. What metrics should we use to assess the trust fund's work? And I'm not saying that anyone's going to necessarily be assessing it from time to time, but it does help us know what we want to optimize for. Is it units built? Is it sort of, in something like a land banking, it might be like potential units. What are we trying to optimize for here? And then this is less related to this plan, but thinking about for the future, but what structural changes in town government would the trust fund would make the trust fund work easier or more effective? So I'm thinking does the statutory basis, composition of the trust fund, board, the trustees, does that make the most sense? What's the relationship between SHOP-C and the trust fund? How do you want that to function? So all questions to think about. Hopefully that we will answer these questions by December. All right, so that's all I got. I'm happy to take questions or just hear your thoughts on any of it.
John, I have a quick question. Just going back, I didn't want to interrupt you any more than I already have during your presentation, but inclusionary zoning, can we go back to that just for 10 seconds? How is that? I'm not familiar with the quid pro quo aspect of inclusionary zoning. What is there a statutory basis for inclusionary zoning where if they develop in that they include affordable units and they'll get 40B type density bonuses? What is inclusionary zoning?
So it varies from community to community. The way I believe it's structured in Southborough is that you are required to build 12.5% of units in a major residential development.
Oh, that's already built into our zoning, you mean?
It's already built into your zoning.
That's what you're talking about, okay.
So those have to be available to 51 to 80% of AMI, and the planning board, who I believe is a special permit granting authority here, can authorize a reduction in lot area requirements on a per unit basis.
That's the incentive. That's the bond. Okay. Sorry. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's all good. And so I guess maybe I'll just ask. Okay, wait, we got Alex here. You're muted, Alex.
Just watching what's been happening here in a few other communities over the last few years, I'm wondering how much of this 40B-like opportunity can, for instance, half a dozen units were built across from Colonial Gardens last year, and none of them were 40B. And there's a whole development going on in Boston now in the Fenway. So what they did was, rather than make some of them 40B or affordable, or however, whatever structure it is, they put pressure on some of the older properties in the area to reduce rents to comply, so that somehow they finagled it. So I guess my question is, if you say 60 units ago, so make that 6 units are going in on a given place in Southborough, is there any requirement that one of them be affordable? And if not, is 40B the only mechanism?
So for a private market development, you do have, with that inclusionary, it does say if a development is of 8 or greater units, it sort of can avail itself of that major residential development, which, there's a bunch of rules around that, but it does say 12.5% of those units have to be affordable, which is 1 out of that 8. I believe, which 12.5%, you're making me do math on the fly. But yeah, I believe it's 1 out of that 8 have to be affordable in a development of 8+ units. If it's 6, not required. If it's a sort of conventional subdivision, I'm not like totally versed in what your laws are, but if it's not availing itself of that major residential development zoning vehicle, then it's not required to do affordable. But so you do have that inclusionary for that one zoning vehicle, and that the structure of that inclusionary program is, I would say, like pretty good. Like 1 in 8 would be like a real good, particularly like suburban inclusionary requirement.
John, isn't 40B 20%? Is that the minimum? Is a 40B project 20% of the units have to be affordable?
Yeah, exactly. But the difference between 40B is, like, 40B is in contravention of zoning. It can just ignore.
Yeah, no, it's a bigger sledgehammer than
so
this ordinary hammer.
It's like it's like you could do a lot more. So like you're asked to give back a lot more.
But like 40R, which is not the sledgehammer approach, they can't override zoning for a 40R project. That's 20% as well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the incentive to the developers. They get also other incentives to build within a 40R overlay district, but it's 20%. I'm just wondering whether 20% is a threshold we should be sort of aiming for, rather than the 12.5% that's built into our inclusionary zoning.
It could work for
That's
any inclusionary project. I would say at Town, and this is like in some ways sounds like a pitch for MAPC, so I apologize for that. But inclusionary programs are really dependent on the financial structure of the deals that happen in town, and that's usually pretty different on a town-to-town basis.
Yeah, right.
Or at least like a sub-regional basis. So like, anytime we're going and recommending a inclusionary program now, we're like, all right, you should pay someone to, to build like a essentially real estate financial calculator to determine what you can reasonably ask before a project becomes unfeasible. Because obviously what you don't want to do is set the inclusionary requirement so high that people are either going to not build and therefore you don't get the affordable unit, or they're going to somehow game, the threshold.
No, I get it.
So there's like an analysis that has to be done. 20% might work in a community with this high home prices.
That's what
I just can't say
yeah.
for sure. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think it's pretty attractive to get units in Southborough, and if a developer can get extra units and extra density, you know, I don't know. I tend to think that 20% would pencil out for a project in Southborough, but
It could work. I'm not. Yeah. I just don't want to like say one way.
Yeah, no, I get it. I'm not asking you to commit. I'm just, I'm probably jumping ahead in terms of starting to flesh out what we want to try to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think there's a question, an open question I didn't ask here because it's not exactly financial. Is sort of like, how does the trust fund advocate? So like you're asking about zoning right now, which is not necessarily in the trust fund's purview. The trust being, you know, more about sort of buying land, spending money, funding programs, that sort of thing. But like it certainly could play a role, as I imagine ShopC does in discussing like zoning or policy matters.
But can't the trust fund, because we've been talking about using the trust fund for zoning changes, you know, so for instance, we've, you know, there's a senior housing bylaw that's super restrictive that, you know, we'd like to get changed. And we talked about potentially creating a 40R overlay district at some point. And, you know, so we have envisioned using trust funds, you know, to pay for people like you to come in and help us, you know, help us.
Okay, I see. I got it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think we are envisioning using trust funds for some zoning as well.
Yeah, that's totally fair game. And
Yeah.
and we can sort of build that into a budget of like how much of the money should go to like policy development or studies or design guidelines. Like 40R is cool because, you know, they have sort of like baseline requirements, but you can hook in design guidelines to it as well and sort of make them legally enforceable. And so you can, you know, in 40R you talk about like it's often 8 units per acre as a baseline for single family, which sounds like a lot, but if you look in design guidelines, you can sort of make that, function without being super disruptive to like a rural New England character.
Gotcha. I know I'm talking too much, but can I ask you one more really quick question? So I'm going back to our South Union School building. If we are outside the half mile and our intentions are thwarted for that being an MBTA community, just off the top of your head, or do you have any thoughts on alternative, you know, strategies for that South Union School building? You know, while we have you on the screen, we talked about 40R, but again, 40R is, you know, it's 20% of the units rather than all the units. We'd love to have all the units be affordable. If 48-3A is not available, do you have any other thoughts on what we might do with that building?
Yeah, so it's a big building, and it's an old building, which means it you know, despite the infrastructure concerns with old buildings, the layout is conducive usually to housing. So like office buildings are hard to convert to housing because the footprint is so big, the light doesn't penetrate into the middle. Like an old school building, like there's usually a lot of windows, a lot of light. So it's a relatively easy conversion, even though you have to like do a bunch of plumbing and stuff like that, which is expensive. So I think
keep in mind that it's a big site. So one of the things we talked about is not only converting the building, but you know, having some additional, you know, 3 or 4 unit, you know, multifamily. What's the word I'm looking for? You know,
Structure.
Yeah, 3 or 4 unit townhouses, you know, 3 or 4 of those or something like that. Again, it's very conceptual, but we have contemplated using the land to develop additional, you know, have a developer develop additional buildings on it.
Yeah, I think what you would want to do if you're looking to go all affordable is like you sort of really want to commit that land to affordable housing and then do one of those partnerships with something like a Habitat, with something like a NOAA. I'm sure you're pretty close to Worcester, so like I'm sure there's also Worcester area agencies who could sort of take that on. But you know, it would probably be a part if you're looking to do something more than that 40R 20% requirement, then you would want to bring in a partner.
And we can't do the MBTA. Yeah. Okay.
There are some, if you were to go 40R route, there are like a couple really good precedents in terms of historic conversions. They're mostly like state hospital sites where you see both a mix of that converted old building and then something like a townhouse development or
Right.
small multifamily like that.
Okay, so I didn't mean to command your time. I just right off the top of my head, if I'm learning on this call that the MBTA community may not be an option, now our minds are spinning about what our other options are for that. So thanks for the insight.
But tonight's meeting for the Housing Authority, the fact that we're not in that MBTA district, should that be changing in any way what I would present as possible funding options?
I think, Alex, my thought on that is, the Housing Authority is the body that has the most actual development experience. Our subcommittee doesn't, SHOPC doesn't. So, to the extent you can raise, the question with the Housing Authority as to whether they'd be interested in taking this on as a project in whatever rubric of statutory scheme that takes on. And we talked about the MBTA community, which would be great. I think that's where we want it to be. But if for whatever reason that doesn't pan out because of the half mile requirement, would they still be interested in taking on an active role in developing this project under some other aegis? So whether it's a public-private partnership or whether it's another statutory scheme or whether it's who knows? I think that's still a relevant question to the Housing Authority.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any other questions for Jean?
I'll go back to my list of the 1,000 questions here.
It's a lot to digest all at once.
Yeah. Can we get this outline?
Yeah, for sure.
Excellent.
Okay. Sarah, do you have anything that you want to add or say? Anything?
No,
Okay.
I think that John did a good job at outlining kind of where we are and, the opportunities that we have moving forward, so I think it's just gonna, be, this group kind of discussing, I think in a little more granular detail, where we think the money, should be spent or could be spent. Like Tom said, maybe some of it is on kind of some feasibility stuff or kind of pushing forward some changes to the bylaw. And maybe some of it is on actual, development of housing. So I think we're in good shape.
Okay. John, I've learned an awful lot this morning. My head's swelling. There's just so much information here, but we are very grateful to have you working with us on this little project. And we thank you for your time this morning and your presentation. And I know we will be seeing you again.
For sure. Thank you for having me and for taking your time this morning. I apologize for talking so much. I look forward to having a more group discussion in the future.
Take care. And thank you
Thanks,
again
John.
for today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Take care. Okay. That was a really good presentation, but I'm taking it all in. I have all these notes. I'm like, holy smokes. This is great. This is really good. So he did a great job. So, okay. Does anybody have anything else that they want to talk about today with any of these things that we've just gone through? Any other comments or
The
discussion?
thing I'm going to suggest is once we get the PowerPoint slide, those questions at the end, I think they're probably good for our next meeting to put some thoughts around that. So we
Okay.
can discuss. There's, like I said, there's a lot in that material, and I was like, a lot of that stuff you have to think about. But I think, was it the last couple of slides he had questions? Why don't we? I'm just suggesting if we could just put some thought behind that, and then maybe our next meeting we can actually, collaborate all of us together, and we can discuss where we want to direct them.
That's
Yeah,
a
I can
great-
agree.
that's a
I sort of
great
feel
idea.
like that slideshow is kind of a program outline for SHOPC, in
Yeah.
general, just what we can do with money is what strategy we can employ, it's very useful. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine, Tom. That was a great idea, Tom. So Sarah, can we get a copy of that presentation? Let's
Sure.
just send the entire presentation to the board.
Sure.
And then if you guys want to take some time to answer some of those questions, if you want to get it to Sarah ahead of time or
Yeah.
to me, we can kind of put them together and then we can send that out and we can have a discussion at the next meeting.
Yeah, that would be good if
Because we're
everybody.
gonna have to do
can
some
see.
homework on this as well. It's not, he's
Oh,
doing
yeah.
it all and then says, okay, do A, B, and C, and then we're gonna have housing. It's not gonna work
Right.
that way. So, all right, so our next meeting is August 25th. It will be an in-person meeting. Is everybody still okay with that? No one has any conflicts for in-person on the 25th? Okay, then anyone want to make a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
We have a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second, and we have a roll call vote. Alex?
Aye.
John?
Aye. Tom B, can you give me a call after the meeting now?
Sure.
Tom B?
Yeah, aye.
Okay, Tom
Yes,
and Dorian is also yes. Thank you, everybody.